The first call came just after sunrise.
A soft, golden haze stretched across the ranch, lighting up the fence posts and the thin dust of the driveway. I should have been savoring the quiet, the kind of silence only a place untouched for generations could have. Instead, I was gripping my phone, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself this couldn't be real.
Ma'am? This is... I'm calling from the Homeowners Association office.
The property you're trying to move into, her voice was saccharine, slow, deliberate.
It's already been sold.
I dropped the phone like it had burned me.
The ranch. My inheritance.
The wide swaths of land my grandfather had worked, the barn I had dreamed of restoring.
Sold. Before I even arrived.
I ran to the window, pulled aside the thin curtain, and squinted at the house I had never set foot in.
The for sale sign was gone. A moving truck idled near the driveway. Men in baseball caps unloaded furniture like they had every right in the world to do so. Excuse me?
I said, more to myself than to the voice that was still on the line.
I'm not an HOA member. This is private property. This is my family's property.
Ma'am, I'm very sorry, she replied, almost robotic.
There's nothing I can do. The paperwork is final. You should contact law enforcement if you feel the transaction was improper.
I hung up and slammed my fist against the counter.
Rage bubbled hot and sharp.
But beneath it, a cold, calculating knot twisted in my stomach. Something about her voice, that slow, practiced tone, made my skin crawl. She wasn't flustered. She had anticipated this reaction.
The next call was instinctive.
911, I could barely articulate the situation to the dispatcher, shaking and biting back tears. Sir, please calm down.
Are you in immediate danger? No, yes. I don't know. Someone is on my property. My family's property. I haven't even moved in yet. They promised officers. They promised investigation.
And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I had just poked a hornet's nest. By the time the sheriff arrived, the moving truck was gone, the new owners inside, the place transformed from a time capsule of my family's history into a generic, polished home with unfamiliar furniture and a faint scent of corporate varnish. Ma'am, do you have documentation proving ownership? The sheriff asked, calm but precise. I handed over the papers, my grandfather's signature still faintly embossed, yellowed with age. He had trusted the property to me, and in return, some stranger had claimed it first. The sheriff flipped through the papers, frowning.
Looks like everything's in order here. But the sale, it appears to have been processed by the HOA. Did you ever submit an HOA membership request?
I felt a laugh escape that sounded like a sob.
I'm not a member. I don't even live here. This is insane. He nodded slowly. I'll file a report.
We'll see what we can do legally, but, ma'am, things are complicated with HOA governance. They can sometimes have authority over unincorporated areas if there's been a miscommunication or previous agreements.
It's messy. Messy.
That word struck a chord.
This wasn't messy. It was deliberate. The flicker of a smirk I imagined on the voice of the HOA rep just hours earlier confirmed it.
She had orchestrated this. Or someone like her had. I walked the perimeter of the ranch, feeling the wind whip against my face, carrying with it the smell of dust and broken cedar. My grandfather's barn stood at the far end, its roof sagging but proud, and I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about stolen land. This was about control, manipulation, someone testing boundaries, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I checked the perimeter cameras I had installed months ago. They were supposed to record wildlife, not human trespassers. But the footage flickered with movement, shadowy figures at the edge of the driveway, moving too fast to be just contractors.
Someone had been watching.
And judging by the timing, they had known I would arrive. By the time evening fell, the light drained from the sky like blood from a wound. I sat in the small cabin on the property that my family had always used as a summer retreat, staring at the phone.
Calls to the HOA went unanswered. Emails bounced.
And yet, in every quiet moment, I could feel it, the calculated, quiet assertion of someone who had crossed a line and thought they could erase history.
I wasn't just angry anymore. I was awake.
My heartbeat kept a steady, cold rhythm.
The threat wasn't abstract, it was immediate. Someone had deliberately violated the one place that meant everything to me.
Outside, the wind tugged at the eaves of the barn. Somewhere in the darkening shadows of the property, I sensed movement, faint but deliberate. The first chapter of this fight had begun.
And I would not lose. The morning sun hit the ranch at an angle that made the dust on the driveway glitter like fractured glass.
I didn't bother checking my phone. Calls to the HOA office and their so-called legal team went unanswered. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving a trail of lies and paperwork in their wake. I grabbed my notebook and camera and began a slow perimeter sweep.
Every fence post, every creaking hinge, every patch of trampled grass was a potential clue. My grandfather had raised me to notice the small things, how a hoofprint could reveal the size of a horse, or how a misplaced nail could suggest tampering. Today, those lessons were my weapons.
The first discovery came near the back pasture. Deep scratches in the soil, faint tire marks, and broken twigs formed a subtle pattern, almost like a trail.
Not the work of the moving crew, someone had been here deliberately, at night. Someone who had been waiting. I drove into town, determined to dig into property records. At the county clerk's office, the clerk squinted at the file I produced, flipping through the yellowed pages like they carried secrets. Sold, huh? HOA oversight, she murmured. Looks like the documents were filed under some secondary agreement from years ago. But it's weird, they don't normally process sales before the new owner applies. We exchanged a look. That weird didn't feel bureaucratic. That weird felt orchestrated. I returned to the ranch with a plan. I set up my own cameras along the perimeter and the barn. Motion sensors, infrared. Anything that could catch movement after dark. Then I dug into my grandfather's old correspondence, letters, receipts, and ledgers that hinted at past disputes. One name kept surfacing, Margot Kingsley. She had been a board member decades ago, and her signature appeared on amendments to the HOA charter. Margot. That had to be the Karen behind the call. The sweet, robotic voice I had spoken to earlier now had a face in my mind, calculating, sharp, the kind of person who smiled while cutting you out of something you were owed. That night, I sat in the cabin, reviewing the footage. A faint, grainy figure passed just beyond the range of the cameras. Slow, deliberate, like a ghost. I froze. Every instinct screamed that someone was watching, even as I watched. The next morning, I visited a neighbor, an older man who had lived in the area longer than anyone else. He had seen the sale paperwork, the HOA's maneuvers, and the sudden appearance of the new owners. But his words carried a warning. They always cover their tracks, he said, voice low, eyes darting. If Margot's involved, she won't stop. She's got people in every office, county clerks, HOA boards, even law enforcement, sometimes. You don't just stumble onto this and walk away. I left with his warning burning in my chest. The conspiracy wasn't just Margot. It was layers of people, shadows I couldn't yet see. And worse, they knew I was looking. I returned to the ranch, retracing the perimeter again. I found something new, footprints leading from the barn to the backwoods, small and precise, like someone was trying not to leave evidence but failing. My heart thumped against my ribs as I followed the trail. It ended at a shallow pit, dug recently, with faint traces of dirt piled to the side. Something, or someone, had been buried. I called in a private investigator I trusted, someone who owed me a favor from years ago. He arrived the next day, moving carefully, scanning every angle. He agreed with my suspicion, the HOA had crossed lines, but this went deeper. There was a network of complicity, and I had to move carefully. Late that night, Margot made her move, or at least her message. An envelope slid under my cabin door. Inside, a single key and a card. Written in tight, elegant handwriting. You're out of place here. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The key didn't fit any locks I owned, but the message was clear, she knew I was watching. She knew I had begun unraveling the threads.
And she wanted me to stop.
I didn't sleep.
I paced the cabin, the flickering shadows of the motion sensor lights outside casting long shapes across the walls. Every creak in the rafters, every distant animal cry, felt like a warning.
By morning, I knew this was no longer just about reclaiming land.
It was about exposing the manipulation, the abuse of power, and the quiet, insidious control Margot had wielded for decades. Every legal avenue felt like a minefield, every witness a potential liability.
I gathered my notes, my footage, and the paperwork from the county.
Step by step, I started piecing together the story that could expose the HOA in Margot. But the deeper I went, the more dangerous it became. Small fires of doubt and threat flickered constantly at the edge of my vision, the phone line that went dead mid-call, the strange car that circled the driveway at dawn, the faint reflection of someone in the windows of the barn that vanished when I blinked. By the end of the week, I had built a fragile timeline. The HOA had sold the ranch before I even arrived, falsified records, and left a carefully constructed trail of legal ambiguity to cover themselves. Margot wasn't just an opportunist, she was a strategist, and the sale was only a piece of a larger plan that no one outside her circle could see.
And yet, somewhere under the fear and anger, a quiet determination settled in me. If they thought I would be intimidated, they were wrong.
I had seen the first signs of their network, and now I was mapping it, piece by piece.
The ranch was no longer just a home.
It was a battlefield.
And I was ready.
The county fair was supposed to be a celebration, local produce, handmade quilts, and the slow rhythm of small-town life. But for me, it was the perfect stage. Margot Kingsley thrived in the spotlight, and it was time to confront her where everyone could see her carefully curated facade crumble. I arrived early, camera in hand, footage and documents stashed in my backpack. The fairgrounds were buzzing, kids running through the rides, the scent of fried food and sawdust mixing in the crisp autumn air. Margot would be here. She always attended the civic events, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, projecting authority. I found her near the judging table for the pie contest, her signature pearls glinting in the sunlight. She greeted neighbors with practiced warmth, her expression calm, almost serene. But her eyes flicked to me as I approached, a faint tightening of her jaw that told me she recognized the threat. "Margot," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline, "we need to talk about the sale of my grandfather's ranch." She tilted her head, her smile unwavering.
"Ah, yes. That unfortunate situation. I'm sure we can resolve it, privately." "Privately?" I lifted my camera slightly. "Or publicly? Because what you've done isn't private. It's theft. Fraud. And I have proof."
Her smile faltered, just for a heartbeat. I felt the charge in the air, the silent ripple of tension that passed unnoticed by the fairgoers but was electric between us. I laid out the documents on the picnic table, HOA sale papers, county records, correspondence linking her to the decision to sell the ranch before I even arrived, even the photographs from my perimeter cameras showing movement on the property when no one should have been there.
The crowd started to notice.
A neighbor squinted, leaning closer. Another whispered something to their partner. Margot's hands, gloved in pearl bracelets, fidgeted just enough to reveal her composure was slipping. You're accusing me publicly," she stammered, voice rising. "Do you have any proof of illegal intent?" I met her gaze evenly. "Intent? You orchestrated a sale you knew I hadn't authorized. You knew I was the rightful heir. You left fake paperwork to cover your tracks. This isn't bureaucratic error, it's deliberate. And I have witnesses, documents, and surveillance footage to prove it." Her smile vanished entirely now, replaced with a thin line of tension. The crowd was murmuring. Phones came out, cameras flashing. The town's civic event had turned into a courtroom without walls. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin me?" Margot hissed, leaning in, her voice low and venomous. But it was clear now, her confidence was cracking. Her authority had been performative, and without the veil of official offices, it was fragile. I dropped the camera onto the table, setting it to livestream. "Everyone can see now." Her eyes darted to the live feed, the murmuring neighbors, the children running nearby.
She realized the stakes had shifted. The power of the HOA, the secrecy, the paperwork, it all depended on invisibility. Now, everything was public. "Stop this," she said sharply, trying to regain control. "You don't understand the consequences." "I understand them perfectly," I said. "And I'm ready." The confrontation escalated. Margot tried to manipulate the crowd, painting me as an agitator, a troublemaker. But the evidence spoke louder than her words: the papers, the photos, the timeline of events. One neighbor, emboldened, stepped forward, confirming the patterns of HOA interference she had witnessed for years. Another added details about her shadowy influence over property sales and civic decisions. The sheriff, who had attended to observe, moved closer. "Ma'am, I've reviewed your documents. There may be grounds for an immediate investigation." Margot's facade crumbled entirely. Her voice wavered, her composure shattered. She tried to bluster, to pivot, but every attempt was met with more evidence, more witnesses, more cameras. The quiet, precise traps I had set during the investigation had worked. And then, in the chaos of the crowd, a final action twist: a car screeched into the fairgrounds, stopping abruptly near the entrance. Two men stepped out, uniformed, but not law enforcement. Security. They moved toward us, hands raised as if to protect her, but I recognized the insignia on their jackets. They were corporate contractors, hired by the HOA, unregistered but visible. Their presence confirmed the scale of the conspiracy. The crowd gasped. Margot's panic was palpable. She turned to them, eyes wide, realizing her control had evaporated. My heart raced, but I stayed calm, letting the moment unfold. Evidence dropped, witnesses spoke, cameras rolled, and the public exposure was complete. By the time the contractors left, escorted by local deputies who had been called in, Margot was isolated. She slumped in defeat, the arrogance that had guided her for decades replaced by raw fear. She muttered something incoherent about mistakes and misunderstandings, but no one believed her. I stood there, the adrenaline fading into a cold satisfaction. The ranch was still in legal limbo, but the public had seen the truth. Margot's carefully constructed empire of influence and intimidation had cracks now, and everyone could see them. As I walked back toward the ranch property later that evening, the sun setting over the fields, I knew the fight wasn't over. There was a deeper network behind her, shadows I hadn't yet illuminated. But today, at least, she had been exposed. The first victory was mine. The ranch was quiet again. Too quiet. The fairgrounds showdown had left ripples through the town, neighbors whispered behind curtains, gossip traveled faster than any official report, and Margot Kingsley had vanished from public events. Her aura of invincibility was shattered, replaced by a visible strain that no amount of pearls or practiced smiles could conceal. I spent the morning walking the property, taking stock of what remained intact. The barn still stood, the fences held, and the wild prairie stretched in familiar, rolling waves across the horizon. The sun glinted off the old windmill, painting long shadows that reminded me of my grandfather's hands, weathered and steady as he built this place from nothing. I allowed myself a moment of calm. The local sheriff stopped by, tipping his hat. "Looks like things are settling down," he said, eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble to rise from the earth itself. "For now," I replied. "But it's far from over." He nodded, understanding that in situations like this, a public exposure might stop immediate action but rarely eliminates the threat entirely. He left, leaving me alone with the land that had been in my family for generations. I spent the afternoon cataloging the evidence I had gathered: footage, documents, witness statements, even the key Margot had slipped under the cabin door. I stored it all in a secure safe on the property, a precaution against the possibility that someone might try to erase my victory with another layer of deceit. Neighbors began approaching, slowly, cautiously. Some offered condolences, some offered support, and a few quietly admitted they had suspected Margot's manipulations for years. Their voices carried relief and admiration. The town now knew someone had stood up against the invisible chains she had wielded. Yet beneath the small victories, unease lingered. I kept noticing subtle signs: broken branches near the barn, footprints that didn't belong, the faint hum of a car idling somewhere just beyond sight. Margot's exposure had been dramatic, yes, but she hadn't acted alone. The HOA was larger than one woman, and their network was built on silent influence and strategic patience. That night, I stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset bleed across the horizon, painting the prairie in blood-red streaks. The wind stirred the tall grass, whispering through the broken fence rails, carrying with it the memory of every injustice that had passed quietly over the years. The phone rang. I froze. Caller ID, unknown. Hello? I said cautiously. A calm, deliberate voice answered, colder than any I had heard before. Congratulations. You've exposed her. That was impressive. Who is this? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. There are others, the voice replied. You think Margot was the only one with influence? You've only scratched the surface. Keep digging, and you'll find that what you're dealing with is far larger than one rogue HOA president. The line went dead. I held the phone, heart racing, a chill crawling up my spine. The first wave was over, but the storm was just beginning. I walked inside, locking the door behind me, and stared at the walls covered in maps, photos, and notes. Each piece was part of a puzzle, and now I realized the puzzle extended far beyond my property, far beyond Margot. Someone had orchestrated this, someone who understood influence, timing, and fear in ways I had yet to comprehend. Sleep came fitfully. I dreamt of the barn, of shadows moving just beyond the light, of a figure standing silently at the edge of the pasture, watching, waiting. When I awoke, the sun was high, and the prairie stretched endlessly, deceptively calm. The community slowly returned to routine. The local news covered the confrontation, framing it as a victory for the rightful heir and a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. Yet behind closed doors, questions remained unanswered. How many times had this happened before? How many people had been pushed out quietly, their properties absorbed into the invisible grid of influence that Margot had represented? I began planning the next steps. Legal proceedings would continue, the paperwork needed to be corrected, and the property fully secured. But more than that, I needed to understand the network behind the sale, the hidden architects of this manipulation who had let one weak link, Margot, take the fall. Days later, I walked the property again, the wind brushing against my face like a warning. At the far edge of the ranch, near the old oak that had marked the property line for decades, I noticed something unusual, a small, folded piece of paper wedged between the roots. I retrieved it carefully, opening it to reveal a single, cryptic message. You've won the battle, not the war. Some pieces never stay visible, and some enemies never die. A shiver ran down my spine. Margot had been a symptom, not the disease. The fight for the ranch, and perhaps for every property she or her network had touched, was far from over. Yet in that moment, standing among the wind-whipped grasses of my inheritance, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I had confronted the first layer, exposed the lie, and claimed the visible victory. And now, armed with knowledge, evidence, and determination, I was ready to chase the shadows wherever they might lead. The ranch was mine to protect. The land had survived decades of storms, droughts, and neglect, and so would I. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, uncertain shadows across the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by Margot, not by neighbors, but by something larger, more calculated, and far more dangerous than I had ever faced before. And in that quiet dread, I realized, the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot.